Some words just sound delicious when you say them or read them. Serendipity is one of those for me. What exactly does serendipity mean, and what in the world does it have to do with events in your life? Stay tuned.
If your desire is to become spiritually stronger, emotionally healthier, and relationally smarter, you're at the right place. Speaker and writer Stephanie Smith inspires and equips you to achieve these three key aims. If you're a parent, you'll also learn how to raise empowered kids, ready for adulthood. Let's get started.
Welcome back. I'm delighted that you are here. We are going to talk about serendipity, and more importantly, we're going to be talking about God's perfect timing as we unpack more of the book of Nehemiah today and look at what can we learn from this, especially when we have those times in our life where we are seeking God and we need something, or we are asking for something to happen within a specific time period, or we are asking God about his timing for choices that we are making in our lives. First, I want to just let you know about a message that I give. This is a powerful message, and it's called Why God? Trusting When Answers Don't Come. If you have a women's gathering, or it could also be a great talk for parents, it is a message that addresses those times in life when we cry out, God, why? Not as a question of curiosity, but as a question of deep anguish and pain when there is something we do not understand that has transpired in our life or in the life of someone that we know and love and is close to us, perhaps even in an entire community. And this isn't a message that says, oh, it all gets wrapped up with a nice little bow, but it is a message that shows from Scripture, and it's something I have learned and experienced in my own life, how we can choose to have a fortified faith even when God doesn't give us the explanations that we are looking for. So you can find out all about that and other speaking engagements that I have on my website, stephaniepresents.com. While you're there, make sure to sign up for the weekly newsletter, High Impact. All right, let's get back to today's focus. First of all, what is serendipity? If serendipity were the name of a dessert, I'm pretty sure that it would have some amount of chocolate in it because it just sounds like a delicious word. But what it actually means is it's an aptitude for making desirable discoveries by accident, or put a more simple way, accidental discovery, or sometimes people use it just as a way of saying, oh, that was a good fortune, or that was good luck. And we want to ask ourselves as Christians, is it just a matter of sometimes things happen by accident? Or what about, is there a time and a place for God's divine timing? And we're going to see that as we look at Nehemiah chapter 8 today. At the end of chapter 7, it records for us that when the 7th month had come, the people of Israel were in their towns. The work of rebuilding Jerusalem's walls were finished. It had taken a record 52 days, which was an astounding feat made only possible because of God's divine favor and protection, and because of people's willingness to work incredibly hard. And then we go on and we read in chapter 8 some other verses, and then we come down to where the people had gathered on the first day of the 7th month. Now, they had let no time lapse between when they had finished the walls and when they gathered for the specific purpose of being taught from the book of the law. These were the first 5 books of the Bible. And we don't know if Ezra and the other teachers that were there walked through all 5 books of the Bible or only some of those. But we do know that they walked through some passages at least, because we read that on the second day of the 7th month, they read where God had commanded via Moses that people should live in booths during the feast of the seventh month. And this was the Feast of Booths, or sometimes called the Feast of Tabernacles. And it is still something that is celebrated and commemorated today. And this was a feast that lasted for 8 days. So let's talk just a little bit about what this feast was about, this festival was about. And then we're going to come back and we're going to kind of look a little bit more at this whole idea of serendipity. The Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, it goes by both names, but it's the same feast. And it had 3 parts to it. The first was, it was a celebration of the fall harvest. It was an acknowledgement, originally intended, it was to be an acknowledgement of God's blessing and provision, just so that crops would grow and they had something to harvest. The second part of this feast was to look back. It was remembering the 40 years that the Israelites had lived in temporary shelters following the Exodus from Egypt, and that divine deliverance that God gave to them when He moved them out of slavery, and He wanted to move them into a place of freedom. Now, their own issues got in the way of that. And isn't that still true for us today, where God is trying to move us out of places of slavery within our own hearts, within our own minds? And He's wanting to move us into complete freedom, but our own issues, our own stubbornness, our own complaining attitudes, and all kinds of other things can keep that from happening, or delay that for years and even for decades. And there's always a high cost to that, for us as well as for other people. But God wanted the people to celebrate this feast because He wanted them to look back, and He wanted them to remember His supernatural provision and care for them that had occurred during those 40 years. Because during that time, God had supernaturally provided water. He had provided food. Literally dropping food from the heavens, that all they had to do was go out and pick it up off of the ground. And the Old Testament even tells us that He divinely prolonged the shelf life of their clothing and their shoes, so that even their clothing and their shoes lasted far longer than they normally would have lasted. You know, last week here in the United States, we celebrated July 4th, Independence Day. And there was a time of that we were looking back. We were looking back to July 4th, 1776, when we commemorate the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And we say that is the day that our nation was established. But the reality is that the signing of that document did not create the United States of America. It was the war that followed that backed that document up with people's property and their blood and their lives that actually made that document a reality. And we look back and we commemorate and we celebrate, as we rightly should, because it was those events all those years ago that allowed us to be able to have the freedoms and the country that we have today. Now, certainly there's a lot that's happened in between the signing of the Declaration of Independence and now, and we do not have a perfect history by any means. And the fight for freedom in different ways and for different people groups has continued to go on in these last over 200 years. But there is something significant for us as human beings about looking back to recognize and realize where we came from, and learning the lessons of history so that we can apply them for our own lives. And one of the purposes of this Feast of Booths was for people to look back and to remember God's supernatural provision and protection Also, to remember that the whole reason that people were having to spend 40 years living in temporary shelters is because of their own stubbornness and disobedience to God. We are to learn those lessons of history, not just so we can go, okay, that's nice. We know something about Bible or we know something about church history. It's so that we can apply those things in our own lives. The best mistakes to learn from are somebody else's. The more willingness that we have to learn from other people's mistakes, the less we will have to learn from our own. Now, another part of the feast, the third part for this feast it was a time of looking forward. You see, on the 8th day, this was an 8-day feast. It was an 8-day celebration. There would be a solemn assembly. And there were a couple of special ceremonies that occurred on this 8th day, which symbolized the coming of the Messiah and everything that he would bring. One of these ceremonies was that golden lampstands were lit in the temple courtyard, and then people would have torches that were lit, and they would carry them around the temple, and then they would set them into the walls of the temple. And the temple, remember, was the place where the glory of God, the essence of God, was represented here on earth. And then what people would do is a priest would carry water from the pool of Siloam to the temple, and this would symbolize the Messiah's coming, and that this would allow people to know God just as broadly and deeply as the waters cover the sea. Well, how broad and deep do the waters cover the sea? I mean, thoroughly. That's all that is there. I mean, it's not like you have part dirt and part water. Otherwise, you have land and sea. The depth of this, the richness of this, the breadth of the coming of the Messiah and how it would allow us to know God was represented by the carrying of this water. In the New Testament, it tells us one time that when Jesus was attending the Feast of Booths, and he stands up on the 8th day, and he makes a proclamation that says, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me to drink." He's referencing this ceremony of carrying the water that would bring the knowledge of God into the earth and make it available for everyone. On the next morning, when the torches would still have been burning in the temple walls, when he makes the statement, "I am the light of the world," he is referencing a ceremony that took place during this Feast of Booths. So going back to the celebration of this festival during the time of Nehemiah, what's the significance of this and what does it have to do with serendipity? Well, first of all, God's timing is perfect. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't just serendipity that allowed the people to read about the need to celebrate this Feast of Booths during the 7th month on the 2nd day of the 7th month. You see, it wasn't just a matter that, well, you just need to pick some 8 days out of the year and then say we're going to celebrate the Feast of Booths. No, it was designated for a certain time period. And during this Feast of Booths, which was to be commemorated during the 7th month, the people learn about it on the 2nd day of the 7th month. They're not even halfway through the month. They're certainly not in the 9th month. I mean, how discouraging would that have been? Or even the 8th month. They begin reading the law and all of a sudden it's like, what? We just now read about this Feast of Booths. Oh, and we just missed it. That was something we were supposed to do last month, and we've missed our opportunity, and now we're going to have to wait for a whole nother 11 months before we get a chance to celebrate. No, they don't have that experience. God is gracious enough to them that he orchestrates events so that they are able to read about this feast that needs to occur this very month on the 2nd day of the month, and they have plenty of time to prepare. You see, what the people had to do was they had to go out and they had to forage and they had to find green leafy branches. And out of those branches, and there were certain kinds of trees that they were to find these from. And out of these, they were to construct these temporary shelters. Think of like a makeshift shelter that you might create if you were out camping in the woods and you don't have your tent to pop up. And you've got to create your own shelter. Well, the people would create these shelters, and that took some time to go find the branches that they needed, to bring them back, to make sure they have enough, to assemble them, to position them so that they're not just going to blow over the first breeze that comes through, and then to make all of the accommodations they would need to live in those for 7 months. It's just like if you go camping. Even if you have a tent that you're going to take with you for your shelter, you still have to do some planning. You still have to decide, what are you going to take? How are you going to fix meals? What kind of food are you going to take? And you're probably not going to pack along a freezer. So what kinds of foods can you take? How are you going to handle refrigeration? Or are you just going to have food that doesn't require refrigeration? You have to do all this planning ahead of time. Well, the people had the same thing that they needed to do as well. They were going to need to make some plans in order to be able to pull off celebrating this feast the way that they were supposed to. Now, at this point, you might be saying, okay, that's all well and fine, Steph, but what does that really have to do with me and my life and my needs right now? Because I don't camp, or I'm not going camping, and I don't see, us going out and coming up with some sort of makeshift shelter that we're supposed to live in. That's not the point of this. Rather, to see the principles that underline all of these things so that we can apply them to our lives. So what does this look like? First of all, the people were positioned perfectly for this timing because of choices that they had been making previous to this. Yes, God's timing is perfect, and He can cause anything to happen at any time for any person whenever He wants. Yet God has established certain principles that the world operates by, and He is not constrained by those principles. He's the one that put them into practice, so He can override them and work outside of them anytime that He chooses. But most of life is lived within those principles. And one of those is this: we position ourselves for God's timing when we have been living and acting in obedience. What if the people hadn't followed Nehemiah when he first shows up with this plan and this commission and this claim that he has the king's approval and the divine calling, not just from the earthly king, but from the King of Kings, to get the people to come together and stop what they're doing at that time, they didn't know how long it would take to rebuild the walls. But basically to say, hey, come along with me, we're going to rebuild these walls. What if the people had drug their heels? What if they had said, no, I don't think so. We've got other things that we're doing right now. What if they would have discounted him? What if when it got tough and it was hot and sweaty and they were tired and they wanted to give up, what if they would have? What about when they had enemies that were threatening to come in with military force? What if the people would have said, okay, this is where we draw the line. We're willing to work hard, but we are not willing to risk our lives in pursuit of completing this project. I mean, Nehemiah, okay, we're only going to go so far. We're only willing to give up so much, to risk so much in order to see something completed that I don't know that it's really all that important to us to begin with. What if that had been people's positions and their mindsets? They may very well have missed this tremendous opportunity. It might have been the 8th, ninth, 10th month of the year when they were gathered together to even read about this Feast of Booths that was to occur during the 7th month. Yes, it is true that we can choose to walk away from God. We can be disobedient and we can come back to Him. And there can be a divine intervention where God basically speeds us up and kind of catches us up to where we would have been had we been walking in obedience, and whether it's days, weeks, months, decades past. But there is the principle that most of life operates in, and it is that our choices have very real consequences. Our choices have outcomes, and God does not divinely supersede all of life's and the earth's principles in order for us to escape the outcomes and the consequences and the impact of our choices. Whether we choose to obey or not can put us in positions where we are aligned with God's perfect timing, or it can put us in positions where we miss opportunities that may either be delayed or we may never get back. Yet the people had chosen to be obedient. They had chosen hearts of humility and teachability, and they had chosen to take tremendous risks and make great sacrifices in order to fully follow what God was calling them to do under the leadership of Nehemiah. And as a result of that, God, I think, rewards them by allowing them to read about this festival that he had instituted. Moses hadn't come up with this idea. It was God that had said, "Hey, Moses, I want you to instruct the people, and here's what's going to happen." And gives all the instructions for this Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. It was God's way of saying, hey, you all have been faithful. You have been showing up. You have been doing the work. And I am going to reward you because on the second day of this 7th month, so you have plenty of time to prepare and are able to fully engage in this festival, I'm going to let you know about this, and you're going to be able to step into a special experience right after completing this major task of obedience that you have been committed to now for these last couple of months. And that's a way that God's divine timing works, and it is a reward for people. It wasn't just serendipity. It wasn't just an accident that the people read about this on the second day of the 7th month. It was a reward that God graciously gave to them because they had chosen obedience over and over and over again in all of the days and weeks and months that had been leading up to this. And when they hear about this booth of this Feast of Booths, they don't dilly-dally around. They don't delay. Again, just like there was no delay between the time that they finish the walls and when they say, okay, now we're immediately going to position ourselves to hear what's next. Now what do we do as a people in order to have a restored and a right relationship with God? You see, every relationship takes care not just to get it off the ground, but it takes nurturing on an ongoing basis. What's next? And that's true for our human-to-human relationships. And it's also true with our relationship with God. There's always a what's next, not in a way of being driven, but in a way of being responsible with our lives and with our relationships. So the people, once they have clarity about what they need to do, they immediately act on it. They don't delay, and they're not also acting with a complaining, griping attitude. Have you ever had somebody that was checking off all the boxes, and on the outside, it just looked like you were supposed to be grateful and appreciative because after all, they were doing all the things, but there was something about it that felt off. It just didn't set well with you. It's not just about what somebody does, it's about the heart that they do it with. And it's a tricky aspect in our human to human relationships because we don't want to become judgmental about someone else's hearts and motives. And yet, that doesn't mean that we act as if we are not to have any responsibility for discerning hearts and motives. We are to do both. We are taught throughout Scripture to grow in our wisdom so that we can discern hearts and motives. And yet at the same time, we're also told to not jump to conclusions and not to make wrong judgments about other people's hearts. So which is it? It's both and. And that's where, again, all of life is lived in this state of tension between two truths that hold each other to account. But what we see here is the people are not acting like, okay, well, that's what God wants us to do. Okay, let's go get our green leaves and build our booths and go hang out there for a week and then whatever, and then we'll get back to our lives. No. It tells us in chapter 8, verse 17, it says, and there was very great rejoicing. When the Bible has a one-word qualifier, we need to pay attention. When it has a two-word qualifier, we really need to pay attention. It doesn't just say, and there was rejoicing. It doesn't just say there was great rejoicing. It says there was very great rejoicing. These people were ecstatic. They weren't dragging themselves out to go find booths and then complaining and then griping and then just go, okay, come on, kids, let's just go get our green leaves. We got to get this done for the day. Come on, okay, or whatever. They didn't have that kind of attitude. They were eager. They were exuberant. They were enthusiastic. They would have been moving with energy. And this was their heart. It wasn't just checking things off on a task to do. It was because their hearts were fully in it. These people's hearts had been fully committed to obedience, to faithfulness, to showing up and doing the hard work day in and day out. And when they learn about something else now that they need to be doing, which let's just be honest, even if you plan a vacation and you're not even camping or living in any kind of, temporary shelter that you have to create yourself, maybe you're going to a resort, you're going to a place that's fully furnished, it's still work planning to spend 8 days away from home. It can be perceived as a big interruption to life, but that's not how these people saw it. And so when we are called to show up, to do the work, to step outside of our normal routines, to maybe have a season, maybe it's a couple of months, just like these people had to devote to rebuilding these walls. Maybe it's a week of setting aside our ordinary life in order to do something that God is calling us to, that we might not even understand the whole purpose of. But when we do those things and when we do them with the right heart, there is going to be great rejoicing, and people will position themselves for God's divine timing and blessing. So looking back to this group of individuals, there are so much here that we can learn from, or we might choose to not learn from. But if we have hearts that are teachable and hearts of humility, then we're going to look back and we're going to see it was their daily obedience. It was their willingness to step outside of their ordinary lives and to do the hard work of rebuilding these walls. It was their willingness to get rid of the rubble. It was their willingness to take tremendous risk, to put their lives and their property on the line in order to follow God, that positioned them for God's divine timing. And also, it was because they weren't just checking off things on a box, but their hearts were truly corrective, and they responded to correction. They responded to truth with eagerness not just with an attitude of, okay, well, I guess if that's what I have to do. And when we are people of faithfulness, then that's one of the ways that we can measure, God, are we just checking boxes off to say, okay, I've done this. I've done my quiet time. I attended church. Okay, I prayed for that person. I prayed for that neighbor. I prayed for that friend. Or how much is genuine joy and rejoicing a part of our lives? Because if that's pretty absent, then we probably need to be looking at what is kind of off that's not leading to very great rejoicing in the opportunities that we have to walk in obedience to God in all things. All right, my friend, that's going to wrap us up here for today. Remember, if you haven't already, you need to go to the website, stephaniepresents.com, sign up for the weekly newsletter, High Impact. And while you're there, look at the speaking engagements that I offer. I do look at custom messages, although I promise I'm never going to speak on something I'm not qualified and prepared for. Love to hear from you. Those ratings and reviews are always very encouraging, and they help other people to find the podcast as well. And until next time, remember this: you have an impact that is immeasurable, eternal, and irreplaceable.
Thank you for listening. Visit the website, stephaniepresents.com, and sign up for High Impact to join the mission of building spiritually strong, emotionally healthy, and relationally smart women and families. You can also book Stephanie to speak at your event and check out additional resources. Together, we can invite and equip generations to engage fully in God's grand story.